Welcome, students. We're going to take some notes on forms of government. Make sure you write at the top of the notes forms of government, and let's begin. So when we look at the government, it's the institution through which a society makes and enforces public policies. So as you see, it starts with the people, and then with the circle of policy making, it ends with the people. So the people, the interests, the problems, the concerns, they then are passed through political parties, political agendas, policy making, laws are created, and that ends up impacting the people through policies. Now we have two different types of government. It boils down to either a dictatorship or a democracy. Dictatorship is government is not accountable to its people. In the example of an autocracy, which is rule of one, or an oligarchy, which is the rule of the few. So there's no accountability, there's no consent of the governed. However, democracy, which is the style of government that we have in America, it's more of an idea, and you have two different types of democracy. The government rules with the consent of the people in mind. The direct democracy is people directly make all of the decisions. For example, would be New England town meetings during the colonial era of America, or indirect democracy, which is what we have today, where people elect representatives to make decisions for them. We have basic types of power. We have the legislative power, the executive power, and the judicial power. Those are the three branches of government. The legislative, we also have House and Senate, so we have two houses in the legislature that make up laws. Much like in Parliament in England, they have the House of Lords, the higher house, like the Senate, and they have the lower house, the House of Commons, like our House of Representatives, which are called congressmen. At the state level, we also have this. We have assembly and we have senators at the state level. Executive power is the president, vice president, bureaucracy, the different departmental government within the executive there. We also at the state level have governor, lieutenant governor, state bureaucracy as well. Within the judicial power, we also have the Supreme Court, the different federal courts. At the state level, we also have the state courts. So as you see with this basic types of power, whether it's at the federal level, which is the legislative, executive, and judicial, or whether it's the state level, we have this system of separation of powers, this checks and balances to protect our system. Not only at the federal level, we have three branches, but also at the state level, which a lot of people don't realize. Distribution of power, we have unitary government, we have federal government, and then we have confederate government. The unitary government is one body, so that means that it's just a national level of government. And that's the example that Great Britain has. Great Britain does not have states like we do in America, and so they have one policy making as a federal government, just simply in Britain. So that's that unitary government, that one body. Here in America, we have state and we have federal. And so that's the federal government. Even though it's called federalism, and it sounds like it's just federal at the national level, federalism means state and federal. And so it's the way that the federal government reacts and arbitrates with the states. So here in America, we have the national level and then we have the state level. You also have a third option, which the CSA during the Civil War was trying to get back to, which is the Confederate government, a loose union of states. And that's what America's government first was after the American Revolution, but we realized that it was too weak and wasn't able to get enough done like a federal and state governments can. So European Union today is closest form today of that. We also had the Articles of Confederation as that type. The definition of unitary government and the definition of federal government and confederate government is something that you will get in your notes or in your textbook. Roots of democracy. No one pretends that democracy is perfect or all wise. Indeed, it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. You don't need to write down this quote from Winston Churchill, but everybody knows that democracy is not perfect, and nobody will defend that democracy is perfect. However, we have found that looking at other forms of government, it's the best form of government that we've been able to come up with. Fundamental values of democratic system: respect for worth and dignity of all people. You have respect for equality of all people. You have a faith in majority rule and minority rights. And necessity of compromise is key. And so, as we see here, it's important to understand that our laws are going to be made by the majority. However, the majority rule cannot take away minority rights. That's why we make certain laws to protect minorities, whether that's a ethnical minority or religious minority. Um, we have this system of compromise. I like this picture here, what you want, what they want, and in the middle is what you really need. And so our laws focus on what we need, not necessarily what we want. And so this equality of opportunity and equality before the law is the big focus. I love what Oliver Wendell Holmes, Supreme Court Justice, said. The right to swing my fist ends where the other man's nose begins. So in America, you have rights, you have freedom. You have the freedom to throw your fists. But once you allow your freedom to infringe on somebody else's freedom or somebody else's rights, that's when it ends. So you can't just do whatever you want if it inflicts harm on somebody else or infringes on somebody else's rights. Otherwise, you are able to. That's all we talk about. You're able to do whatever you want in your home, but outside of your home, you start to come in contact with other individuals that also have their rights. Widest possible degree of individual freedom. That is the focus in America, is that we want freedom to the widest degree, as long as that freedom does not infringe on somebody else. For example, with slavery, it was long believed that the slave master had the freedom to take away freedom from an African slave. However, with the 13th Amendment, we made that unconstitutional, that is not okay. That goes against the Constitution. It goes against this whole idea of minority rights. Basic concepts of democracy also extends to the economy. Free enterprise system, economic system with private ownership of goods, investment determined by private decisions rather than the government, determined by competition in a free market economy known as capitalism. So this free enterprise system is what we have in America, that the government doesn't plan the economy like a socialist economy, or the government doesn't control all industries like in a communist Marxist economy, but you have this maximum freedom. Law of supply and demand. When supplies of goods and services are plentiful, prices usually drop. When supplies are more scarce, prices usually rise. And we've seen this from time to time. Mixed economy. Private enterprise exists in combination with a considerable amount of government regulation and promotion. Government tries to protect the public and promote private enterprise. So as you see right here, we have the idea that democracy is more of a key value. We just talk about what it looks like in politics, but what would it look like in the economy? That's what we're focusing on here. Democracy is a political system and capitalism is an economic system, but they both stress the idea of individual freedom. That's very important to understand. Government protects the public with regulations like antitrust laws, food laws, pollution laws, zoning ordinances, and other things like that, building codes. Government promotes economy by granting money for research, transportation, schools, postal system, weather reports, national currency, public safety, things of that nature. And so the government has its role within the economy, but a limited role in the idea of capitalism, because we want that free enterprise. The entrepreneur is what we value, that risk taker, that business risk taker um, in capitalism. The Greeks, they were one of the earliest forms of direct democracy in 500 BC, Athens, Greece. The voters were males, Athenian citizenry, uh, slaves, females, immigrants. They did not have the power to vote because the Greek style of voting was based on who was the physically strongest. They had a idea of valuing physical strength, and so the democracy power, the voting power, was held by males, not females, in this Greek style of democracy. You will have some other people groups, such as some Native American groups, that will have the females as the voters in the direct democracy, but in Athens, Greece, it would be the males. The Romans, the Roman Republic, this is where we get the term republic. Senators represent the people's vote. So there's, under republic, you have this representatives, and that's what we have most clearly in America. Yes, we have some direct democracy at the state level through propositions and referendum. However, at the federal level, we only have a republic. Now, this republic is not just a system of representatives, but it's also having a constitution. And that's actually the most important part of the republic, is that a document that shows how the government works. In Roman times, it was called the Ten Tables. And so this document is what provides maximum freedom. Because if you think about it, under a democracy, if we grant certain rights to females or to minorities, and then that can be voted on and taken away, that's a problem, and democracy becomes ugly. But if you have a constitution that protects the minority from the majority vote, then you're able to have a more healthy and balanced society. That's the goal. How to hear the voice of the majority, majority rule, popular sovereignty, popular vote, while at the same time also protecting the minority vote and the minority privileges, which are all our privileges. The Roman style of government works a little bit better because of that, because the direct democracy, as we saw in Athens, Greece, would end up being a system where you could just vote off somebody to die, somebody to be kicked off your island, so to speak, or to be sentenced to death, which would happen to Socrates, because the Athenian Greeks would blame Socrates for their problems during the Peloponnesian War. They would actually vote for him to be executed, and that's the ugly side of democracy. And so America values more of a republic, but the word democracy is that more of an idea versus a direct democracy that we do in America. Philosophical contributions, we have Montesquieu's principles, the separation of powers, the three branches of government. Those are really his ideas, and I think that's most fascinating. I think out of all the philosophers, Montesquieu is one of the most important ones when it comes to America's government, because he really came up with this idea of needing three different powers and the roles of those powers, that you have a Congress, a legislative branch that creates laws based on the will of the people, that you have an executive branch that enforces those laws, like the president, and then you also have a judicial branch that settles those disputes as they arise. The rights of the individual was very key and very important under Montesquieu. You also have Rousseau. He believed in this thing called the social contract theory, that people agree to give up power needed to promote safety and well-being. So even though we are a free society, we will give up those freedoms to the government so the government can do its job. And we see that through people obeying different state laws when it comes to pandemics. that you give up your rights in order for the government to do their job and to thrive and to protect other people's rights. That's kind of the idea there. The social contract theory that the people have a contract with the government and that they both need to respect each other. So that people respect the government's laws, but the government also needs to create laws that honor the people and with the people in mind, the consent of the governed. Locke is probably the most influential and broadest philosopher um, because of his natural rights philosophy that all the other philosophers would build upon. He influenced Thomas Jefferson quite a bit with his Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson's principles would be natural rights, the idea of life, liberty, and property, religious freedom, states should protect rights, and that citizens should rebel against unjust governments. And so, as you can see, John Locke would inspire much of the American Revolution, Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, and how we would move forward as a society in America. Moving to the Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1776 was the famous year. Issued many attempts to solve issues with Britain. So there was time and time again that there were desires to resolve the disputes between America and Britain. However, it came time to separate from Great Britain, to separate. And so the Declaration of Independence would list around 28 grievances against King George. It's not just one statement or one line. It's not just one thing that King George or Parliament did that they believed was wrong, but it was actually 28 reasons. And so this is kind of a list, 28 things I hate about you, so to speak, America towards Great Britain. The main principles within the Declaration of Independence that we have would be the idea of natural rights. That's a main principle within there. The consent of the governed, the limited government. Those are the three principles within the Declaration of Independence. The idea of natural rights is rights inherent to human beings, not dependent on the government. So it's not the government that gives people rights, but people have rights inherent. Inherent means God-given. And so it's very important to understand that God gives rights, not man. And when you get into a society where man gives rights instead of God, more of a humanistic or atheistic or nihilistic society, you have a lot of hopelessness that comes, and you have a lot of autocrats and oligarchies that are able to develop because it's the individual rulership, the dictatorship, that gives the rules or the rights instead of God. Consent of the government, people must agree on who their rulers will be. And that's why every 4 years, election night for the president is so important, where the people vote, and no matter if it's a Republican or a Democrat, whoever gets elected that night, the other side concedes. And so it's very important when the failing president concedes to the other president, whether it's going to be Joe Biden or Donald Trump that will give that concession speech to the other. It's an important part of our government where the people agree on who is going to rule, and so does the loser, so to speak. Limited government must be clear restrictions on what rulers can do. And so, again, having that constitution that we'll get into later will dictate what are the powers of the government and what can the government do and what can the government not do. For example, the states have the power over driving laws, over alcohol laws, over marriage laws, over gun laws. The federal government isn't supposed to touch those issues. It's the states. The government focuses on more broader issues. And so it's that important piece of limited government that makes our society so different and works well. Thank you for taking these notes. That is it.